could move a little bit closer to the front and center of the room, it'll facilitate our being able to hear each other. Okay, while everybody's getting comfortable, I'll start with a few logistics. The banquet dinner tonight is in this hotel in the restaurant, which is right down the hall. It's at 8:30. It'll be a buffet, so if you've signed up, just down the hall. For those who have signed up for the tour tomorrow in the park, the bus will leave from the front doors of the hotel at 8:30 tomorrow morning. And so we'll go out to the park. It'll be really fascinating. You'll get great food, and we'll be back by 7 or 8. Yeah. Comfortable. If you have closed-toe shoes, it might be more comfortable. It's not hiking, but it is a little bit of sand, probably. After coffee and then lunch, so you get fed. Okay, and so in general, over the last 3 days, we've heard a lot of just really excellent talks that I have really enjoyed. And I hope that you've all had a chance to look at the posters, because there are also quite many very nice posters. And so I would like to thank especially the invited speakers who helped choose which of those posters are going to get prizes, because it was difficult. And so we have a few poster prizes to award. So there's one for each session. So I'm just going to start saying them, but if you hear your poster called, if you could come up, and then we'll get a picture of all the winners with their certificates. Okay, so the first best poster prize for the session Phenotypic Responses to Global Change goes to Influence of Climatic Factors on Genetic Structure and Phenotypic Variation in English U. For the session Monitoring Ecosystems Responses, the prize goes to Habitat Niche of Two Closely Related Seabirds Breeding in Sympatry. For the session Emergent Diseases in Changing Environments, the prize goes to Effects of Climate and Landscape on Mosquito Populations in Dinyana. I know you're here, I can see you. For the session Consequences of Global Change in Biotic Interactions, the prize goes to Effect of Climate Change on Temporal Mismatching in Plant-Butterfly Interactions. For Breakdown of Species Boundaries, it goes to Wild Boar Invasion Treats Biodiversity in Mediterranean National Parks. That should be threats, no? We can fix that. For Biological Invasions, the prize goes to Evaluating the Impact of Exotic Predator Invasion on Amphibians Breeding in Temporary Ponds, Crayfish, and Amphibians in Dinyana National Park. For Adaptation and Speciation in Response to Changing Environments, it goes to Adapting Ecological Restoration to Global Change. For Population Responses to Global Change, it goes to migrate or not to migrate? That is a question. Forecasting plant extinction under climate change in a Mediterranean hotspot with a stochastic hybrid model. And lastly, but not leastly, a worldwide survey of genome sequence variation reveals the evolutionary history of the honeybee. Let's see. It's not possible that there's not one single author from any of these posters here. Please come up. Please take your... But Jordy, didn't I mention one with your name? Let's see. Take a picture of both of you together. Is that okay? Okay, so as most of you, but perhaps not everybody knows, before this Congress officially started, we had a series of Day Zero workshops. There were 5 workshops with the vague themes of time, genomics, disease, distribution, and hybridization. And we're going to hear a tiny bit about what happened in each of these discussions. So do you want to start, Carlos? The genomics.
Well, okay. Our group was supposed to discuss something about genomics. And we sent before a few papers to read, to have some ideas on studies on adaptation, on loss of genetic diversity and the limits of ranges, and some revisions, no? And we had some very vague ideas. How can genomic approaches contribute to tracking and monitoring neutral and adaptive change over the short time period interested when we think about global change, just a couple or 3 decades. However, when we started the discussion, we went in absolutely random directions. And I see that we end up thinking about conservation. How can we use, conservation-related issues? And after seeing the interest of the group, we ended up splitting into smaller groups for discussion. And one was thinking about evolutionary rescue, and the other one on molecular quantitative genetics. I was in the second, but I have some notes of what was going on in the first group. So, on the evolutionary rescue, we heard this afternoon some very interesting talks about this, no? And, well, the idea was that it seems that it's something that has been well studied in models with model organisms and in the lab, and there is not that much empiric data. And this is, well, trying to see if some species can rescue, or some populations can rescue themselves from extinction, no? Through point mutations or even alleles that arrive from somewhere else. And this group discussing it were emphasizing on natural populations. They were speaking a lot about the importance of population size, environmental degradation, and the role of effective dispersal. And they focus a lot on effective dispersal as a source of new alleles. Thinking in this line, they divided the discussion in 3 ideas. No? First, imagining this, a scenario when we have two populations in the same habitat. The habitat is in good condition, but they are demographically isolated. And they were thinking about the Iberian lynx, for example, 2 populations that are fragmented, isolated, but the habitat is not especially degraded. And that seems the ideal case scenario where this rescue could work, this and they were speaking a lot about assisted translocations. And in this case, there is some anecdotal evidence that this is working. There is in the management plan some translocations being taken, and this seems to work. Another scenario was a little bit more tricky. They were thinking about environmental gradients and populations locally adapted to the local conditions. And it was not very clear how that would work in those conditions, how the transfer of genes would help the rescue of populations that are locally threatened. And there was a little bit more discussion on where this would go. And there was a brief discussion on the role of invasive species and hybridization, and how this could contribute. They spoke in this framework of how genomics could help to understand these processes. And basically the idea is, well, with genomic tools we can have a better precision of our estimates, but is that enough to move into genomic approaches? And then they emphasize, okay, what we really want is that we can use these approaches to see if there is local adaptation and to identify even deleterious alleles that could be important in management programs. And they emphasized a lot on the need of experimental evolution experiments. Then there was another group where I was thinking about molecular quantitative genetics. This is something that is being developed right now, and it seems that there is basically no studies being developed. I don't think that John Slade is around. No? Okay. He was the main person explaining this. We're discussing about adaptation to global change, but we're continuously coming up to the idea, okay, looking at single genes or single alleles, changes in allele frequencies, well, we're looking at a very small portion of the total variance, not the main source of variation. And most of the traits that we are considering are polygenic. So maybe we are looking at single genes, we are not really tracking environmental change as it should be, no? And then John was telling us about this molecular quantitative genomics. And basically the idea is to look at single populations through which we can have genomic data that could allow us to have even estimates of relatedness better than with pedigree information, and complement this with extensive phenotypic information, and this would allow to a better characterization of the structure of the genome, of how traits are working, and how they could be subject to selection. No? The idea is that with this, it would be even possible to identify breeding value for different individuals, this has been developing from the animal and plant breeding fields, no? And would be possible to assign breeding value to individuals, and this could help to improve management programs. In fact, they were mentioning the possibility of using these approaches to identify areas with recessive alleles that could be excluded from captive breeding programs, for example. It seems that in captive breeding programs, it's a bad idea to make experiments or crosses just trying to avoid specific alleles, but this could be more a genome-wide approach that seems to provide better estimates. The problem is that for these approaches, we need lots of markers, genomic approaches, lots of individuals to have a good estimate of the architecture of how the variation is distributed. And an additional good thing about this would be that would help researchers and managers close a little bit the gap. There are some discussions that managers very often do not understand the results of population genetics studies. They say, okay, yes, but what do we need to do? Increase the frequency of this gene? They want very hands-on changes, and this kind of approaches would allow to show in a more explicit way how the variance is distributed across the genome. And, well, we're thinking that probably these kind of approaches would end up showing, okay, that what we want is overall increasing diversity on the genetic diversity, and that maybe we'll go back to encouraging people to use just a handful of markers that could give good estimates. However, yeah, I think that the managing of assigning breeding value to individuals shows a lot of promise for managing of natural populations, and this may be one of the big advantages that genomic tools could provide for conservation. In critical cases would be. And I I think that were some of the highlights.
So I was co-organizing the invasion and hybridization workshop, and so we had a fairly detailed plan to start with, all aimed around getting ideas on paper and the basic structure of an article to come out of this day. And our day did center around coming together, having general discussion, then breaking up into smaller groups, and then breaking up those groups even further to speak on smaller, interesting topics that had come up during the more general discussions. So basically, we divided into a few main lines. So I don't have any notes with me, so I'll be a bit shorter than Carlos. But we look at the processes that were occurring when you have hybridization due to invasion, and we came up with a list of those, and then what are the consequences of this group of processes, and which ones are contributing more or less in different situations. And one interesting class of interactions that I'm sure will be developed in the paper were ecological consequences. So we were looking at what happens when you add new hybrid species into food webs, for example. How does that change the whole ecosystem functioning? And also questions about space and time. So how are invasions involving hybridization that have a human component different from more natural range shifts, or even species changing shifts tracking climate change? And we came up with a few ideas. For example, they're probably more spatially and phylogenetically distant, so perhaps the underlying processes are fundamentally different and might lead to slightly different outcomes. And then we finish with lots of kind of open questions and hopefully kind of directions and recommendations for further research. So hopefully it'll be an interesting little paper, and we'll keep at it.
Everybody, so I've drawn the short straw for our group. I think I'm here because I'm the most talkative, not because I've got anything intelligent to say. We had fun. It was a diverse group. We were the time group, so we were given the objective of talking about time, so fairly narrow. And we spent a lot of time getting to know each other. We had a diverse set of backgrounds in terms of questions and approaches. We had people who were doing paleogenomics, like Louisa. We had people doing sort of deep time genomics, more ecological, neo-evolutionary time. Folks like myself who are doing sort of very short-term evolutionary dynamics, community dynamics. We had others interested in particular questions of how evolutionary responses or adaptation affect invasive species, and ideas of regime shifts, and issues of conservation concern. What happens when a charismatic species like a wolf has to deal with environmental change? So as you can see, these are the sort of the collections of ideas that we were talking about, and how to find some common theme based on time wasn't obvious until we realized that it was the breadth of temporal perspectives that was the thing that was going to be the thread. And so we realized that there was value in combining a paleo approach with an ecological or eco-evo approach, and we centered around the idea of evolutionary resilience. So this is an idea that's about 2 years old. It was published in 2010 by sort of colleagues of Ari Hoffman. I think ideas like it have existed for a long time. We think about evolutionary stable strategies. We talk about game theory. We think about these ideas that a genetic system can evolve and maintains this property of evolvability. But in the terms of evolutionary resilience, the way that Hoffman and colleagues define it, they're talking about something that refers to the ability of a population to persist in their current state. And so this is closer to engineering resistance. Right? A population can hold its state, maybe the genotypes are changing, there's turnover genetically in the population, but basically the population doesn't change. This is different to what I think, or we thought, evolutionary resilience should be, which should be closer to more of the ideas that, imagine Buzz Holling talking to Darwin. So you've got this idea that an evolutionary system is labile and flexible and can maintain its capacity to adapt to environmental change. And this is broader than, for example, the idea of evolutionary rescue, which is just simply the idea of a single type of demographic outcome of evolutionary change. We're talking about something that's closer to the capacity of a population to maintain its adaptive potential in a changing environment. And we try to identify some features of that adaptive potential. And with the glorious aim of writing a paper around reshaping the idea of evolutionary resilience. So we had 4 features. One of these is the idea of tolerance. This is the idea that this is the maximum amount of change a population can be changed genetically before losing its ability to recover. Okay, so that could be the simple erosion of diversity, of genetic diversity, but it could be plasticity, it could be all sorts of features of the underlying genetic network and how it's restructured, but we're talking about the tolerance of the system. The second idea is resistance, or the ease to which we can actually change or sculpt the genetic system. All right, so I'm thinking about, do we switch from some sort of asexual mode of reproduction, pathogenetic system, to a sexual and back again? These wholesale changes in the mode of functioning of a genetic system. Then there's what we would sort of defining as precariousness. So this is a state variable. This is the idea that how close can the current genetic system stay at or close to an adaptive threshold. So this is an idea where a population completely shifts its genetic attractor. And the question is, how close can you take it before background levels of variation push it into another adaptive dynamic? So this is ideas coming from adaptive dynamics, and the idea that a population can be forced to go into some sort of evolutionary suicide, or it can fix. And so this is very much a systems view of an evolutionary process. And then the final aspect was sort of the underlying, sort of the structure, the network structure of the system, whether that be in terms of the genetics, so you're looking at changes within genetic levels of genes, or at the level of the genetic network, how much are those, how integrated does this genetic response have to be? A lot of what I was thinking of in this particular example is that when we push genetic systems to the limits of their tolerance, then we get this cryptic variation that's hidden in the genome being elicited, and that cryptic variation can then becomes visible, becomes observable, and can be selected and fixed in the population. So that was pretty cool. We talked about that, and then the final thing was, well, what's the physical evidence of changes in resilience, evolutionary resilience? I mean, do we observe it only at the population level? Do we observe it at the community level? Can we see signals of this in the demography and the structure and function of a system? And I mustn't forget that Dan was really insisting that we think about behavior and the speed with which organisms are making behavioral changes and the genetic basis of those behavioral changes being an important component of evolutionary resilience. So that sort of sums it up. I think the paper will be built around this time axis, that if we want to think about measuring evolutionary resilience, whether there's evidence for it, then we need a paleo approach for that. And the amazing transformation in the historical power of paleogenomics right now is going to be a driver of that. And then a more theoretical systems-based approach of how evolutionary systems remain labile and flexible. And that's it.
Hi. I will summarize the symposium and the workshop discussions on disease. We have been discussing that society clearly urgently demands answers on how global change may affect disease in humans and in animals. But the problem is that these answers too often have came from too naive models that have done very general statements on the role of biodiversity on protecting human health or on the impacts of climate change on disease. We have been discussing different examples on the problems on this approach and on how the relationship between biodiversity and illness may be positive, negative, or not significant. So there is no much support for this an effect of biodiversity on dilution of disease. And on the other way, we have been seeing and discussing how non-linear effects of climate on, for example, vector and disease prevalence may make difficult to obtain generalizations on the effect of climate on disease. Additionally, climate may have opposing effects on different components of the transmission cycle. Our workshop was practical, so we went to the field to see how human activities has changed the face of Doñana. We have been visiting the rice fields, we have been visiting the fish farms, and discussing how this change may affect the contact rates of humans or of animals with disease. We have been discussing how it's possible that a disease like West Nile virus is present both in North America and in Europe, but have completely different impacts in both areas. We have been discussing different possibilities to explain these different patterns. We realize that for a same pattern like is the absence of malarial parasites from particular group species, we had different explanations, and that when we started to discuss, we realized that any of these explanations by itself may explain the pattern, so that we need to use new approach to identify the proportion of variance in the prevalence of malarial parasites in birds that is explained by phylogenetic components, by ecology, and by other factors. So we discussed potential approach to solve that. And finally, we incorporated ourselves to the food web in Doñana, and we checked that the rice field production is okay and that the fish farm is working well and the fish they produce is tasty and very good. So after that, we came back to Sevilla for the meeting. So thanks.
Is there anybody from the distribution group that wants to give a quick overview? I see Eloy isn't here. Ah, excellent. We have a volunteer. Great. Just a few words? Thanks.
I'd like to thank Eloy for bailing on this part of it, and Hugo for denying that he was part of the group. I guess ours quite similarly went, so obviously I've got no notes at all. I think ours also turned into quite a conservation-aligned discussion, and if I recall, we kind of put up, what did we do? It was kind of the way in which we kind of put up a bunch of questions like, why would you want to know about the distribution of organisms? What is the range actually used for? And then what are those questions? And most of those came down as conservation issues, either in an applied way, like how a manager would actually use them, or in terms of how you would, we got into a whole faff about whether you would need to define invasive species and native ranges and non-native ranges. And this was one of the kind of major practical applications of it. I think we ended up thinking it would be actually quite a short point about when the range is useful. Hugo, nod when I say something sensible. when the range is useful, when distribution is actually important. Did we come up with any major? We finished by lunchtime. I mean, this is how. So Eloy was going to write this all up, send it round to us all, and we were going to agree whether that was what we had thought about or what things were going on. But obviously, as you can tell, it doesn't sound like we got anywhere. Sorry, I wasn't really expecting this. So, when is the distribution an important thing to consider? I guess that is the major thing that we came up with. Whether it is actually certainly within an evolutionary context and within a conservation context.
I think there's a microphone coming because, Phoenix? This is supposed to be the discussion, so if you feel like putting your 2 cents in, please just jump on in. But some of the themes that came up in those really great descriptions of our Day Zero workshops, thank you, also came up in a lot of the talks that we saw, and there were some themes that I thought ran across multiple sessions, and I thought some of the themes which I noticed, perhaps because I thought they were particularly interesting, was the problems in identifying true selection in these very rapidly changing systems. Okay. And this evolvability, plasticity theme, and when it's evolution versus plasticity. And another theme which I saw in very many talks was that the interactions that we had really nice curves and lines to describe actually didn't fit those really nice curves and lines at all, and were very much more complex, and this was with single species reactions, community reactions, and unexpected side effects, like the parasites of the invasive species that we saw towards the end of the day, and causing both winners and losers. Did anybody else notice these themes or think any of them were interesting? This leads to some of these future predictions of distributions being very difficult to predict. And another theme I thought was interesting was that the populations don't move as fast and in the way that we thought that they should, and that they have this tendency to have some sort of stasis or hold their ground even when their temperature gets too warm or whatever, by using microenvironments, or somehow use the advantage they have by just being there already. Or maybe somebody has another idea about why that happens. Okay. So there are also things that we didn't talk about. We talked a lot about species moving into new habitats, and also species who were sort of at their limits. They were moving up the mountain, but oops, they're already at the top of the mountain, so there wasn't much more up to go. But we didn't sort of talk about the other end of that range, and if there were new niches or opportunities sort of at the other end of that range, and the effects of that, new opportunities. I'll stop talking if one person makes one comment.
Well, I have a question actually. So, can you talk to the idea? I have a question about. I know it sounds probably pragmatic, but there was talk of a special issue. Can you talk to that a bit, because that might help motivate people to say something?
Okay, so there is, and I forgot to mention that, it was on my list, thank you, a special issue of the journal Evolutionary Ecology Research associated with this Congress. So obviously it's not published. We're hoping that this issue, which hopefully will come out perhaps next year, will reflect the content of the Day Zero workshops that we heard about earlier, but then also hopefully reflect some of the other issues and research which has been presented by the speakers, which were very informative, complimentary, and occasionally conflicting. And I hope that all of that becomes reflected in the issue, because that will make it much more exciting. You have a specific question?
I'm still talking. So I think there's something in the title of the whole conference which is interesting, and that I don't know if people have been thinking about it, but there's adapting to global change, and that can be organisms adapting to global change, and then there is human beings adapting the system so that it can adapt, and even the human system itself. And those are three parallel ideas about how adaptation to global change can be happening, and it sort of hasn't really been talked about explicitly. And it would be interesting to have if there was going to be a special issue, but even just some sort of proceedings from this, that issue should be raised. I think a lot of the time we've talked about the scientific basis of adaptation, how it happens, the speed of it, the extent of it, whether it's happening or not. We all probably in here believe in a neo-Darwinian synthesis, so we believe it happens, and so in that case, how important is it to convey to policymakers that it's an important element that we should be managing for? And do you manage for that in a different way to managing for just basic ecological persistence? And I think those are we haven't really dealt as a community with those questions, and that would be an interesting thing to talk about. Anybody else has anything to say about that before I knock myself out?
What I can say is what I learned from being here. I learned that there is a difference with other habitats, other biomas. We have seen in other areas they have been so clever to plan, to planify, study, long-term studies. And one thing that I miss in the Mediterranean hotspot is that I wonder if we'll be able to have that ability to think in the next 20 or 50 years from now. Start areas where we can conduct surveys for the next 20 or 50 years. Now, I think the Mediterranean is going to move. We see in some of the talks, going to move northward. But I think also there is areas here that behave as refuges. That will be also an areas very interesting to compare what would happen with the rest. So my proposal would be if we will be able to do that, to start research, long-term research based on different Mediterranean areas.
So the reason I asked you to leave is because your organization has kind of been working on that for longer than I knew about. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing for that?
Okay, so I'm not really a specialist on biology or ecology, but I work on conservation issues at Tour du Vala in France. And what I think after this very interesting conferences that I saw the last 3 days, it's that you are doing a very good job on scientific issues and very hard science issues, but we should think more about what we would like to do with all these scientific results in order to better protect and to better conserve the ecosystems in general and the environment and the nature in particular. So I think this is maybe one of the weaknesses that we have now with the scientific research, is that we are doing science more for science, but less for people and for nature conservation. So maybe we should think more about these issues in the future, because we are scientists and we are doing science, but why are we doing science if it's not for protecting nature and for better conservation and protection? So that's all what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any other issues or comments? Are you? No? Oh, great.
This is a response really to your point, Andy, in terms of the need to put the humans into the equation that we've not really been doing so well within the current meeting. And it was just a reference back to a paper that was published in, I think it was 2009, which is the Medaill and Diadema paper, looking at the kind of micro evolutionary hotspots within the Mediterranean or around the Mediterranean basin, or the microphylogeographical hotspots, as they put them. And they identify about 52 of these areas of particularly unique biodiversity within species around the Mediterranean, and then go on to associate those with centres of human population pressure and find a tremendous overlap and growing overlap between the two. So it's really a comment that, yes, that's a very valid point, and it's something that there's a very much a pressing need to do, rather than something that we should just pay lip service to. Because in terms of looking at adaptation to change in the evolutionary sense, there's an absolute road crash between identifying these spots from the evolutionary point of view and the human adaptation point of view, because as humans we're adapting by moving into those hotspots.
Okay, well, I guess we'll just wrap it up with that idea, and dinner at 8:30. Thank you, everybody.